The morning light crept softly through the lace curtains of John Hay's modest living room, illuminating the metals glinting faintly on his faded military uniform. At 72, John had long traded the vigor of his youth for the quiet dignity of age, but the sight of those metals still carried a weight that words could not measure. Standing before the mirror, he adjusted the worn jacket one last time, his fingers brushing the ribbons he had earned in battles that now felt like distant echoes. This trip was long overdue. Today, he would see Thomas, a brother in arms who had stood beside him through mud, gunfire, and the unyielding silence of loss. They hadn't seen each other in decades, life having pulled them into separate currents. Yet, as the years wore on, the ache of those unspoken bonds grew heavier, urging John to fulfill a promise they had made long ago. "This time, Thomas," he murmured to his reflection, "I'm coming to see you. Just wait for me." John's son, Michael, had insisted on booking the flight. "At least let me get you a comfortable seat," Michael had said, waving away John's protests. Despite his humble upbringing, Michael had risen to prominence as the CEO of a major airline, a fact John rarely mentioned. His pride in his son was immense, but private, he didn't wear it like a badge. When Michael handed him the business class ticket, John smiled faintly, both touched and amused. "That boy worries too much," he said to himself, his voice tinged with affection. He hesitated only briefly before slipping on his scuffed leather boots, relics of another era. They contrasted sharply with a polished image he imagined would populate the sleek business class cabin, but they were part of him. Like the uniform, they told a story he wasn't willing to leave behind. The airport was bustling, a sea of hurried faces and rolling luggage. John moved deliberately through the crowd, his pace steady, his shoulders squared. Yet, as he approached the priority check-in counter, he felt the weight of their stares brief, assessing glances that lingered just a second too long. His uniform, his boots, his age, they drew silent questions he could almost hear. Why is he here? The young woman at the counter didn't hide her skepticism. She looked him over with a glance that started at his boots and ended at the creases in his weathered face. "Are you sure you're in the right line, sir?" she asked, her tone polite but clipped. John nodded calmly and handed her the ticket, saying nothing. Her hesitation was brief, but unmistakable. After a quick inspection, she returned it with a strained smile. "Have a nice flight," she said, though the words felt hollow. John simply inclined his head, walking away with the quiet grace of someone who had nothing to prove. Inside the plane, the business class cabin gleamed with understated luxury. Soft leather seats and muted lighting promised comfort and calm, yet John's presence seemed to disrupt the equilibrium. He felt the subtle shift in the air, the stolen glances, the curious whispers. Adjusting his uniform, he settled into his seat, his back straight, his gaze steady. Not far away, a flight attendant named Lucy noticed him almost immediately. Young, polished, and sharply dressed, she exuded the confidence of someone accustomed to a certain rhythm of life. Her eyes flicked over John with a faint furrow of confusion, as if she were trying to reconcile the man before her with the world she knew. She approached, her voice cool and professional, but with an edge that couldn't be ignored. "May I see your ticket, sir?" John handed it to her without a word. Her eyes scanned the paper, then returned to him, her expression tightening. "I see," she murmured, returning the ticket with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Not everyone can afford business class." The words were quiet but barbed, laced with an unspoken judgment. John met her gaze, his expression unchanging, though a faint sadness flickered behind his eyes. He had heard those words before, not in tone, but in intent. He had endured them on battlefields, in mess halls, and in the quiet spaces where men thought no one was listening. He said nothing, his silence carrying more weight than any argument could. As the plane took off, John turned his gaze to the window, watching the clouds drift by in solemn procession. The hum of the engines provided a familiar background noise, steady and unyielding. He thought of Thomas, of the years they had spent side by side, and of the promise that had brought him here. His heart swelled with a quiet resolve. This was more than a journey. It was a test, a reminder of who he was and what he stood for. The world had changed, yes, but some things had not. Prejudice lingered, not in loud declarations, but in subtle dismissals, in the quiet refusal to see the person behind the appearance. John closed his eyes, letting the memories come and go like waves. He had fought wars on foreign soil, but the battles he faced now were quieter, more insidious. Yet he knew one thing for certain. He would meet them the same way he had faced every challenge, with dignity. The flight stretched on, the hours marked by the slow arc of the sun outside his window. And as the clouds rolled by, John Hayes sat unmoved, a solitary figure who carried with him the weight of stories untold, the strength of a life lived with quiet courage. The cabin hummed softly with the sound of engines and the murmur of passengers easing into their seats. Business class was its own small world, separated from the bustle behind it by a drawn curtain and unspoken rules of decorum. Drinks were poured with precision, voices were kept low, and the air seemed to carry an expectation of comfort, exclusivity, and quiet. John Hayes sat among it all, his old uniform and scuffed boots a quiet anomaly against the polished shoes and tailored suits around him. He hadn't come here seeking attention, but it found him anyway. He felt the fleeting glances, some curious, others faintly disapproving. The whispers were almost inaudible, but their meaning wasn't hard to discern. The flight attendant, Lucy, moved briskly through the aisle, her sharp eyes sweeping over the passengers. She carried herself with an air of authority that belied her youth. Her steps slowed slightly as she approached John's seat, her gaze settling once again on the faded uniform and its owner. She hesitated but moved past him without a word, stopping instead to serve a well-dressed man a row ahead. John noticed, but didn't react. He had learned long ago that dignity often required silence. It wasn't until her second pass that John began to wonder. The drink cart paused at every row, each passenger greeted with a polite question. "Would you care for a beverage?" But when Lucy reached his seat, she glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable, before continuing without offering him the same courtesy. For a moment, John considered saying something. He could have called her back, could have pointed out the oversight. But then he thought better of it. Maybe it had been an accident. Maybe she simply hadn't seen him. He told himself it wasn't worth making a fuss. Still, as the minutes ticked by, the thought lingered. On her third pass, Lucy's pause at his row was so brief it was almost imperceptible. By now, the cart was nearly empty, the glasses reduced to a few scattered remnants of what had been a full offering at the start of the flight. John decided he could no longer ignore the pattern. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice calm and polite. "Could I trouble you for a glass of water?" Lucy stopped, her expression carefully neutral, but her tone colder than it needed to be. "I'll see if there's any left," she said curtly, as though his request was an inconvenience. John nodded and waited, his hands resting lightly on the armrests of his seat. It wasn't the words she had used that stung, but the way they had been delivered. They carried an undercurrent he had felt before, one he could never quite shake. When she returned with a glass of water, she placed it before him with a perfunctory motion, avoiding his eyes. Her indifference was palpable, a thin veil over what felt to John like disdain. The man seated beside John, who had been watching the interaction, spoke up suddenly. His tone was firm but measured, his voice cutting through the quiet tension. "Excuse me, miss," he said, turning to Lucy. "This gentleman is seated here too, and he deserves the same service as the rest of us, doesn't he?" Lucy froze, caught off guard. For a moment, she seemed unsure how to respond. Then she turned back to John, her lips pressing into a thin smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course," she said, though the words lacked sincerity. Before walking away, she added, almost under her breath but loud enough to be heard, "Not everyone knows how to act in business class." John met her gaze, his own calm and steady. Her remark was sharp, meant to wound, but it slid off him like water over stone. He had heard worse, far worse. And he knew, from years of enduring such slights, that rising to her bait would only give her power. Instead, he replied simply, I believe respect is something that should be offered to everyone, no matter where they're sitting. The man beside John shifted uncomfortably, as though the weight of the exchange hung heavy in the air. "You're a patient man," he said softly, leaning toward John. "I don't think I could have kept my cool like that." John turned to him and offered a faint smile. "Everyone has their own burdens," he said. "Sometimes, it's better to meet them with calm than with anger." The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. For the rest of the flight, he seemed to watch John differently, not with the passing curiosity of others, but with a growing sense of respect. Lucy, meanwhile, avoided John's gaze for the remainder of the journey. But there was something in the way he had looked at her, something in the quiet dignity of his words, that unsettled her. It wasn't the uniform or the boots that lingered in her mind, but the steadiness of his presence, the way he had carried himself without faltering, even in the face of her thinly veiled disdain. As the flight continued, John turned back to the window, letting the clouds drifting by fill his thoughts. This wasn't new to him, the judgment, the assumptions, the quiet barriers placed in his path. He had lived with them for so long that they had become part of the landscape. But they hadn't hardened him. He refused to let them. Outside, the sun dipped lower in the sky, its golden light brushing the tops of the clouds. Inside, the small world of the business-class cabin carried on, its rhythms undisturbed. Yet, beneath the surface, the quiet divide between John and Lucy, the unspoken conflict of perception and prejudice remained. It was not a war fought with words or raised voices, but with looks, gestures, and the silent weight of unspoken judgments. And, as always, John bore it with the same quiet strength that had carried him through so many battles before. The steady hum of the plane engines was a soothing constant, a background rhythm that blended seamlessly with the muffled conversations and the rustling of pages from an open newspaper. For most of the passengers, the flight was uneventful, a routine journey from one destination to another. But for John Hayes, it was something else entirely. He sat quietly in his seat, gazing out at the endless expanse of clouds beyond the small, oval window. The golden glow of the sun kissed their tops, a serene reminder of the simplicity that often eluded life on the ground. Yet his thoughts were far from serene. The words of the young flight attendant, Lucy, echoed faintly in his mind, not just the words themselves, but the tone, the slight edge of dismissal that had clung to them. It wasn't the first time John had encountered such moments. They had followed him through life, like shadows cast by the long, unyielding light of history. He remembered the first time he had felt it so clearly. It was decades ago, long before his hair had turned white and his shoulders had begun to stoop under the quiet weight of age. He had been a young man then, full of pride and purpose, wearing the same uniform he now wore. But back then, the medals weren't there yet. The fabric was newer, the creases sharper. He had walked into a diner just off a highway, still stiff from a long bus ride back from basic training. The waitress had looked at him, her gaze sliding over the uniform as if it didn't matter. She had seated him at a small table near the back, away from the other customers. He remembered the way she hesitated when she poured his coffee, how she avoided his eyes when she set down the plate of eggs and toast. Her smile, thin and obligatory, had felt more like a wall than a welcome. He had eaten quickly, keeping his head down, pretending not to notice the whispers from the other tables. He had told himself it didn't matter, that the uniform was enough to speak for him. But as he walked out that day, he had felt the weight of the stairs on his back, like invisible hands pushing him toward the door. Now, as he sat in the business-class cabin, those memories felt closer than they had in years. The faces had changed, the settings were different, but the feeling was the same. It wasn't anger. He felt John had long since let go of that. No, what lingered was something quieter, heavier. It was a kind of weariness, an ache born from the knowledge that time didn't always heal as it promised to. Across the aisle, a young couple whispered to each other, their eyes flicking toward him before quickly darting away. John caught the glance, but didn't acknowledge it. He had learned to let such moments pass without confrontation. They weren't worth the energy. Instead, he turned back to the window, letting the soft glow of the sun fill his vision. Lucy passed by again, her footsteps light but deliberate. She didn't pause at his row this time, didn't even glance in his direction. Her avoidance was almost as loud as her earlier disdain. John watched her retreating figure for a moment before looking away. It wasn't her fault, he told himself. Not entirely. She was young, likely shaped by a world that still struggled to see past appearances. He could hardly blame her for that. After all, hadn't he seen the same struggle in men and women who had fought beside him, shared foxholes with him, trusted him with their lives? Even in the trenches, the lines weren't always easy to erase. He thought of Thomas, the man he was traveling to see. Thomas had been there in those days, standing shoulder to shoulder with him, enduring the same doubts, the same whispered suspicions. They had faced it together, silently resolving to prove their worth through action, not words. And they had. Time and again, they had stood firm, showing their courage on fields of battle where nothing else mattered but survival. But even after all they had given, the world had not given back in kind. Thomas had once said, "They don't see us, John." Not really. They see the uniform, the medals, but not the men behind them. John had nodded then, unable to find the words to agree. Now, years later, he felt the truth of those words more deeply than ever. As the flight stretched on, John closed his eyes, leaning back into the seat. The hum of the engines seemed louder now, like a distant drumbeat echoing through time. He thought of the battles he had fought, both on the battlefield and off. He thought of the young man he had been and the older man he had become. The fight had changed over the years, but the battlefield remained. The passenger seated beside him shifted slightly, breaking John's thoughts. "You know," the man said, his voice quiet but steady, "I couldn't help but notice what happened earlier. With the flight attendant." John opened his eyes, turning to the man. He didn't say anything, just waited for him to continue. "It wasn't right," the man said, glancing toward the aisle where Lucy had disappeared. "The way she treated you. I'm sorry you had to deal with that." John offered a faint smile, his expression calm but unreadable. "You don't need to apologize for someone else's actions," he said. "Besides, it's not the first time, and it probably won't be the last." The man nodded, his face thoughtful. "It's just, I don't understand why people still act like that. You'd think we'd have moved past it by now." "So would I," John said, his voice quiet. "But some things change slowly. Too slowly, if you ask me." They sat in silence for a while after that, the words hanging between them like an unspoken truce. The man didn't ask any more questions, and John didn't offer any more answers. Some things didn't need to be said aloud. As the plane began its descent, John gazed out at the clouds one last time. They drifted by, soft and unbroken, untouched by the turbulence of the world below. He wondered, not for the first time, if people could ever be like that, free from the weight of history, untethered by prejudice. For now, it was enough to know that he could still carry himself with dignity, even in the face of quiet hostility. It was enough to know that he hadn't let the shadows of the past darken his view of the present. And so, as the plane touched down and the cabin filled with the rustling of passengers gathering their belongings, John Hayes sat still for a moment longer, his hands resting lightly on his knees. He had traveled far in his life, but the journey was far from over. The terminal was awash with the familiar sounds of arrival, the hum of conveyor belts, the crisp voices over the intercom, the hurried footsteps of passengers eager to move on to their destinations. John Hayes walked through the crowded space with a steady pace, his old leather boots clicking softly against the polished floor. Around him, faces moved in and out of focus, some lingering for a moment too long before turning away. John didn't mind. He had become accustomed to those glances, the subtle reminders of how his uniform and the man wearing it seemed out of place in such a modern, polished setting. For him, the walk through the terminal was just another stretch of his journey, no more remarkable than the miles he had already traveled in life. As he approached the baggage claim, a familiar voice broke through the noise. "John Hayes. Well, I'll be..." Turning toward the sound, John saw Mrs. Helen Carter, his neighbor from back home, her face lighting up with surprise as she waved enthusiastically. She hurried over, her footsteps quick and sure despite her own advancing years. "Helen." John greeted her with a small smile, opening his arms for the embrace she offered. "What a coincidence." "I never expected to run into you here," she exclaimed, stepping back to take in his appearance. Her eyes lingered on his uniform, the metals glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. "Still wearing that old thing, I see." "It still fits," John replied lightly, his tone betraying a hint of humor. "And it's comfortable enough." Helen's smile softened as she reached out to touch one of the medals gently. "It's more than that, John. It's a testament to who you are." John didn't respond immediately, his eyes glancing down at the floor. "It's just an old uniform," he said after a moment, his voice quieter. "But it's served me well." Their conversation was interrupted by the screech of wheels on tile as a baggage cart rolled past, and behind it came the sound of footsteps, quieter, hesitant. John looked up to see Lucy, the young flight attendant from the flight, standing a few feet away. Her polished shoes shone under the terminal lights, but her face looked pale, her expression a mix of shock and uncertainty. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice almost a whisper. Helen turned to Lucy, then back to John, confusion flickering across her face. "You know each other?" she asked. "We were on the same flight," John said simply, his tone even. But Lucy didn't move. She seemed frozen in place, her eyes darting from John to Helen and back again. It was clear she had overheard enough to piece together what John had never mentioned on the plane, that he was more than just a quiet man in an old uniform. He was the father of Michael Hayes, the CEO of the airline she worked for. The realization hung in the air between them, unspoken but heavy. Helen, sensing the tension, broke the silence. "John, I still don't understand why Michael didn't come with you. He could have made the trip easier for you." John's lips curved into a faint smile. "I told him I wanted to travel on my own. He has enough on his plate without worrying about me." Lucy's face shifted, her composure slipping further as she listened. Her eyes widened slightly, the weight of her earlier actions settling in her chest. She had dismissed him, ignored him, treated him as if he didn't belong, and now, she realized, she had done so to the father of her employer. "I need to apologize," Lucy said suddenly, her voice trembling. Her hands clasped nervously in front of her as she looked at John. I didn't treat you fairly on the flight. I misjudged you." John regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with the same quiet grace he had shown throughout their earlier interactions, he inclined his head slightly.
"Thank you," he said.
"But you don't owe me anything." Lucy blinked, clearly taken aback. "But John raised a hand, his voice calm but firm. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is what we learn from them." Helen watched the exchange with a curious expression but said nothing. She could sense that this was something deeper, something more than just a conversation about an in-flight misunderstanding. It was about assumptions, about the way people judged each other, often without even realizing it. Lucy nodded, her face flushing as she muttered another apology before turning and walking away, her steps quick and unsure. John watched her go, his expression thoughtful but untroubled. He had seen moments like this before, had lived through them enough times to know that change, if it came at all, often came slowly. "She seemed upset," Helen said, her voice gentle. "She'll be fine," John replied. "Sometimes, it takes a mistake to see things clearly." Helen tilted her head, studying him. "You're too forgiving, John." John smiled faintly. "Maybe. But it's not about forgiving her, it's about not carrying something that isn't mine to hold." As they stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, John took a deep breath, letting the cool breeze wash over him. He hailed a taxi, the driver's eyes flicking briefly to his uniform before nodding and loading his bag into the trunk. As John settled into the back seat, Helen waved him off, her smile warm but tinged with concern. "Take care, John," she said. "And don't let anyone make you feel like you're less than you are." John nodded, his voice steady as he replied, "I stopped letting that happen a long time ago." As the taxi pulled away, he leaned back against the seat, his thoughts drifting once more to Thomas, the friend waiting for him at the end of this journey. He wondered what Thomas would say about all this, about the quiet moments of judgment and redemption that had marked the day. Knowing Thomas, he would laugh softly, shake his head, and remind John that some things never changed. And maybe they didn't. But as John watched the city pass by through the window, he couldn't help but feel that some things could have given enough time, enough patience, and enough quiet resolve. The taxi slowed as it approached a modest single-story house nestled on a quiet street. The front yard, though small, was well-kept, with a lone rocking chair stationed on the porch. John Hayes stepped out, his old leather boots crunching against the gravel. He paused for a moment, taking in the sight of the place that had become his friend Thomas's sanctuary. It had been decades since they had last seen each other, but the memories they shared felt as close as yesterday. Those memories were etched into John's mind. The nights spent in foxholes, the unspoken camaraderie of men who had faced death together, and the silent strength they had offered one another when the world seemed most hostile. He knocked gently on the door, his hand steady despite the anticipation building in his chest. A few moments later, the door creaked open, and there he was, Thomas. Thomas sat in a wheelchair, his once broad shoulders now slighter, his frame leaner. Time had taken its toll on his body, but his eyes, those piercing, unyielding eyes, remained as resolute as ever. For a moment neither man spoke. Then, as if no time had passed, Thomas's face broke into a warm, genuine smile. "John," he said, his voice roughened by age, but filled with emotion. "You made it."
I promised, didn't I?
John replied softly. Thomas gestured for him to come inside, and John stepped into the small living room. It was a simple space, but every detail spoke of care and history. Photos lined the walls, snapshots of family, friends, and a younger Thomas in his uniform, standing proudly beside his unit. The past lingered here, not as a shadow but as a testament to a life lived with purpose. They sat together in the living room, a small table between them holding 2 steaming cups of tea. The conversation flowed easily at first, filled with updates and small anecdotes. But as the minutes passed, the weight of unspoken truths began to settle in the air. "You know," Thomas began, his voice quieter now, "I've been thinking a lot about those days. About what we fought for." John nodded, his gaze fixed on the tea in his hands. "Hard not to." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the ceiling. "Do you ever wonder if it made a difference? All those battles, all those sacrifices? Sometimes it feels like nothing's changed, like people still see us the same way they always did." John didn't respond immediately. He let the question hang in the air, its weight familiar but no less heavy. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and reflective. "I used to wonder that, too. But I've come to believe that the fight wasn't just for the world, it was for us. For the men we became, because of it." Thomas tilted his head, considering the words. "But what about now? After everything, we're still judged by how we look, by the uniforms we wear or don't wear. Doesn't it ever get to you?" John met his friend's gaze, his expression steady. "It used to. But I've learned not to let it take away who I am. I can't control how others see me. I can only control how I see myself." The room fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that could only exist between 2 people who had shared more than words. Outside, the sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft patterns on the floor. For a while, they simply sat there, letting the moment stretch on. Thomas broke the silence first. "You know, John, you've always had a way of keeping your head high no matter what." John smiled faintly. "It's not always easy. But I figure dignity's the one thing no one can take from you unless you let them." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're right. And I suppose that's why we fought, isn't it? Not just for freedom, but for the right to hold our heads high." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, old stories from the war, the times they had laughed in the face of danger, the names of comrades they hadn't thought of in years. The past came alive in their words, weaving a tapestry of shared experiences that no amount of time could unravel. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the room, Thomas's expression grew serious again. "John," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I'm glad you came. It means more than I can say." "I wouldn't have missed it," John replied. "Your family, Thomas. Always have been." Thomas smiled, the lines on his face softening. "You're a good man, John. Better than most." John shook his head. "Just a man trying to do right." As the visit came to an end, John helped Thomas to the porch, where they sat side by side, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of blooming flowers. Neither man spoke much. There was no need. Their bond, forged in the crucible of war, required no words to affirm its strength. When it was time to leave, John clasped Thomas's hand firmly. "Take care of yourself, old friend," he said. "You too, John. And don't forget you've already made a difference, whether the world sees it or not." John nodded, his heart heavy but steady. As he walked back to the waiting taxi, he felt a sense of peace. The visit had been brief, but meaningful, a reminder that even in a world filled with division, some connections remained unbroken. As the taxi pulled away, John glanced back at the house, at the figure of Thomas framed in the doorway. He thought of the years behind them and the uncertain road ahead. The battles they had fought were over, but the fight for understanding, for respect, for dignity, that fight continued. And for John, it was a fight worth carrying on, one quiet step at a time. Lucy sat at her small desk in the airline staff lounge, the hum of conversation and the clatter of coffee cups blending into a backdrop she barely noticed. Her thoughts were elsewhere, back on the plane, in that quiet business-class cabin where John Hayes had sat with an air of unshakable calm, his old military uniform and weathered boots a silent challenge to the polished world around him. She had misjudged him. Worse, she had dismissed him. And now, knowing who he was, not just the father of the airline's CEO, but a man who had lived a life of sacrifice and dignity, Lucy couldn't shake the weight of her actions. The day after the flight, Lucy found herself reading articles about veterans, about the struggles they faced when returning to civilian life, about the quiet battles they fought daily against a society that often overlooked their worth. She even looked up John Hayes, finding snippets of his life, his military service, his medals, his role in his community. The more she learned, the heavier her regret grew. It wasn't just about him being someone important. It was about realizing how little she had seen past the surface. She had let his appearance, his simple clothes, his quiet demeanor shape her entire perception of him. And in doing so, she had become exactly the kind of person she had always told herself she wasn't. A few days later, Lucy was called into a meeting. Michael Hayes, the CEO, had summoned his staff to discuss a new initiative, a training program focused on respect and service. The announcement came in the wake of several incidents, though Michael didn't name names. Lucy knew, deep down, that she was the catalyst for this change. Michael spoke calmly, his words measured but firm. "Our customers come from all walks of life. Each one of them carries a story, a history we may never fully understand. It's not our job to judge them. It's our job to treat them with dignity." Lucy shifted in her seat, feeling the weight of his gaze as it briefly swept over her. He didn't say anything more, but he didn't have to. She knew he was giving her a chance to take responsibility not just for her actions, but for the values she carried forward. The training sessions began the following week. For Lucy, they were more than an obligation. They were an opportunity to reflect, to unlearn the biases she hadn't realized she held. The sessions included stories from veterans, passengers, and employees who had faced discrimination. One story, in particular, stayed with her, a young veteran who spoke about returning from service only to be treated as if he didn't belong in the very country he had fought to protect. "That's the hardest part," he said, his voice steady but tinged with pain. "Not the battles overseas, but the ones you face when you come home." Lucy thought of John Hayes, of the quiet dignity he had carried in the face of her own dismissal. She thought of the way he had looked at her, not with anger, but with something deeper, something that made her question herself in ways she hadn't before. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, Lucy wrote a letter. She didn't know if John would ever read it, but she needed to put the words down. "Dear Mr. Hayes, I owe you an apology not just for the way I treated you, but for failing to see you for who you are. I made assumptions based on nothing more than appearances, and in doing so, I disrespected not only you, but the values I claim to uphold. Since that flight, I've thought a lot about the weight of my actions. You taught me something without ever saying a word, that dignity isn't something we give or withhold based on our perceptions. It's something inherent in every person, something we must honor. Thank you for your patience, your grace, and your quiet strength. I hope one day I can live up to the lesson you gave me. Sincerely, Lucy. When Lucy handed the letter to Michael Hayes the next morning, she felt a mix of anxiety and relief. Would you give this to your father? She asked. He raised an eyebrow but accepted it without question. Several days later, Lucy received a response, a simple handwritten note in careful script. Dear Lucy, thank you for your letter. My father once told me that growth doesn't come from never making mistakes, but from learning from them. It seems you've taken that lesson to heart. We all carry burdens, and we all misstep at times. What matters is what we do after. I see that you've chosen to reflect and to change, and for that, I commend you. Remember, respect is a two-way street. When we offer it freely, we often receive it in return. I hope you continue to carry this lesson with you, not just at work, but in life. Best regards, John Hayes. Lucy kept the note in her desk drawer, pulling it out on difficult days as a reminder of the lesson she had learned. Over time, she noticed a change in herself, not just in how she interacted with passengers, but in how she saw people in general. Each person who stepped onto her plane became, in her eyes, a story waiting to be understood, a life deserving of kindness. She thought of John often, his quiet strength and unwavering dignity. And though she never saw him again, his presence lingered in her life, a quiet reminder of the power of humility and grace. For Lucy, that single flight had become more than just a routine day at work. It was a turning point, one that had reshaped not only her career, but her perspective on the world. And in the quiet moments, when the cabin lights dimmed and the sky stretched endlessly outside the windows, she found herself silently thanking John Hayes for the lesson she would carry with her always. The airline's training program rolled out quietly, without fanfare or press releases. It was a deliberate choice by Michael Hayes. For him, this wasn't about public relations, it was about change. The sessions were intimate, reflective, and deeply personal, designed to challenge employees not just professionally, but on a human level. Each session opened with a simple message. Every passenger carries a story, and it is our job to honor it. For some, the words felt like platitudes, but for others like Lucy, they rang with truth that was hard-earned. The training room was filled with a mix of employees, pilots, ground crew, and flight attendants like Lucy. Most sat quietly, their attention fixed on a screen at the front of the room. The session began with a video, a montage of voices recounting experiences of being judged for their appearance, their clothes, their accents, or the color of their skin. One voice stood out, a veteran, his tone steady but laced with emotion. "It's not the stares that hurt the most," he said. "It's the silence that follows. The moment when you realize someone has already decided who you are without knowing a thing about you." Lucy's breath caught as the words echoed in her mind. She glanced down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, and thought of John Hayes. His calm, his patience, his silent endurance of her earlier actions. The memory still stung, but now it drove her forward, pushing her to listen more closely. Later, a guest speaker took the podium, a middle-aged woman named Clara. Her story wasn't dramatic or flashy. It was, in many ways, painfully ordinary. She described growing up in a small town where her family was one of the few Black families in the area. She spoke of subtle exclusions, unspoken assumptions, and the quiet exhaustion of having to prove herself again and again. "Racism isn't always loud," Clara said. "Sometimes, it's the absence of kindness. The hesitation in a smile. The way someone's eyes shift when you enter a room. Those small things add up. They tell you over and over that you're not supposed to be here." The room was silent, her words sinking in like stones dropped into still water. Lucy felt the weight of the silence in her own way. It reminded her of that moment on the plane, the way she had walked past John's row without stopping, the way she had let her assumptions guide her actions. Sitting in that room now, she realized just how easy it was to fall into the patterns Clara described. After the session ended, Lucy lingered, waiting for most of the group to file out. She approached Clara, her steps tentative. "Thank you for sharing your story," Lucy said, her voice quieter than usual. Clara smiled warmly. "I'm glad it resonated. Sometimes, all it takes is one person listening." Lucy nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle in her chest. "It did," she said. "It really did." Over the next few weeks, the training sessions continued, delving into deeper discussions about empathy, respect, and the unspoken biases that everyone carried. For Lucy, the lessons didn't end when the sessions did. She began to see her passengers differently, not as names on a manifest or faces in a crowd, but as individuals with lives she could only guess at. One evening, during a quiet moment in the galley, she struck up a conversation with an older passenger sitting near the back of the plane. He wore a simple cardigan and carried a well-worn paperback. Lucy asked about the book, and the man lit up, explaining it was a biography of a musician who had inspired him during his youth. By the time the conversation ended, Lucy had learned more about him in 10 minutes than she had learned about most passengers in years. It was a small moment, but it felt significant. For Lucy, it was proof that seeing people truly seeing them didn't require grand gestures. It just required paying attention. One morning, Lucy found an envelope waiting for her at the staff lounge. Inside was a handwritten note from John Hayes. "Dear Lucy, I heard about the training program and the effort you've put into it. I want you to know how much it means not just to me, but to everyone who has ever felt unseen. The work you're doing matters, more than you might realize. Thank you for listening and for choosing to change. It's not an easy road, but it's one worth walking. I have no doubt you'll continue to make a difference, in your own way. With gratitude, John Hayes." Lucy read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in her bag. She felt a swell of emotion, not pride, exactly, but something quieter, deeper. A sense of connection to a man who had shown her, through his silence and his dignity, what it meant to truly respect another person. By the end of the program, the airline's culture had begun to shift. Stories like John's became part of the company's lore, shared during orientation sessions and team meetings. Employees started seeing each other differently, too, their shared experiences creating bonds that hadn't existed before. For Lucy, the changes were personal as well as professional. She no longer saw her job as just a role to perform. It had become a platform to practice what she had learned. Every interaction, every passenger, became an opportunity to extend the kindness and respect she had once withheld. One afternoon, Lucy stood at the front of the cabin as passengers boarded, her smile genuine, her tone warm. An elderly man with a walking cane stopped before her, his eyes searching hers. "First time flying," he said, his voice a little shaky. "Not sure I belong up here." Lucy bent slightly, meeting his gaze with a steady smile. "You belong here," she said simply. "And we're lucky to have you." The man's face softened, his shoulders relaxing as he shuffled to a seat. Lucy watched him go, her heart lighter than it had been in years. In that moment, she realized she was finally beginning to understand the lesson John Hayes had taught her. It wasn't about erasing the past or undoing mistakes. It was about moving forward one quiet act of respect at a time. The day of the ceremony dawned quiet and clear, sunlight spilling over the city like a gentle promise. In a small, unassuming hall near the airline's headquarters, employees and guests gathered to honor veterans who had served not only their country, but also the values of dignity and perseverance. Among them sat John Hayes, his old military uniform freshly pressed, the ribbons on his chest catching the light. He hadn't expected this. When Michael first mentioned the idea of a ceremony, John had waved it off, insisting that his story wasn't worth such attention. But Michael, ever persistent, had said, "Dad, this isn't just about you. It's about the lessons you've taught us, all lessons we can't afford to forget." And so here he was, seated in the front row, feeling slightly out of place, yet deeply honored. The ceremony began with Michael taking the stage. His voice was steady, but carried the weight of emotion as he spoke. Today, we gather to recognize those who have shown us what it means to live with integrity. People who, through their actions, have reminded us of the values that unite us even when the world feels divided. Michael paused, his gaze falling on his father. One of those people is my father, John Hayes. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of meaning. Michael continued, his words measured and deliberate. My father taught me that dignity isn't something granted by others, it's something we carry within ourselves. He showed me that even in the face of judgment or misunderstanding, it's possible to stand tall, to meet the world with quiet strength. As he spoke, John shifted slightly in his seat, his hands resting on his knees. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but he couldn't deny the pride he felt not for himself, but for the message his story seemed to carry. Lucy was there, seated near the back of the room. She had volunteered to help organize the event, seeing it as a chance to honor the man who had taught her so much. As she listened to Michael's words, she felt a swell of gratitude, not just for John, but for the opportunity to grow, to change. When Michael stepped down from the podium, the applause was warm and steady. He walked to his father, bent slightly, and shook his hand firmly before leaning in for a brief embrace. The gesture was simple yet profound, a testament to the bond between them. As the ceremony concluded, guests mingled, sharing quiet conversations and words of appreciation. John moved through the crowd with his usual unassuming demeanor, stopping now and then to shake hands or exchange a few words. Lucy approached him cautiously, her heart racing slightly. When he turned to face her, she smiled nervously. Mr. Hayes, she began, her voice steady but soft, I just wanted to thank you for everything. John studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful but kind. You've come a long way, he said finally. That means more than any thanks. Lucy nodded, feeling her throat tighten with emotion. I'll keep trying, she said. I promise. John's smile deepened. That's all any of us can do. As the evening wound down, John found himself standing alone near the hall's entrance, watching as people trickled out into the night. Michael joined him, his hands in his pockets, his expression reflective. You did well today, Dad, Michael said quietly. I didn't do much, John replied with a faint smile. Just live my life. Michael shook his head. It's more than that. You've shown people what it means to live with dignity. That's something we need now more than ever. John didn't respond immediately. He looked out at the city lights twinkling in the distance, his mind drifting to the moments that had shaped him, the battles fought, the judgments endured, the quiet victories that never made the headlines. Maybe, he said at last. But it's not about being seen. It's about doing what's right, even when no one's watching. Michael nodded, his gaze steady. That's exactly why it matters. As John walked out into the cool night air, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The ceremony, the recognition, it was all unexpected, but it wasn't what truly mattered. What mattered was the way people had listened, the way they had opened themselves to understanding. For John, the journey wasn't about erasing prejudice or solving every injustice. It was about planting seeds, small, quiet moments of change that could grow into something larger over time. And as he walked down the quiet street, his old boots scuffing softly against the pavement, John Hayes carried with him the unshakable belief that dignity, once claimed, could never be taken away.